So excited to have this special episode with Professor Nancy Pearcey and her new book, The War on Toxic Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Such an important discussion, and if you're in classical conversations, your students will read many of her books. So without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello and welcome back to another episode, a special episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today my guest is Professor Nancy Pearcey. Nancy is author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, currently #1 on Amazon, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth in Total Truth. And if you're in classical conversations, you'll recognize a number of those titles. She is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the New Yorker, Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in the Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Nancy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I love to hear about how people accepted Christ, especially someone who was a self-proclaimed agnostic. So can you just tell our audience a little bit how you found Christianity and how you got to where you're such a preeminent voice in the space today?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yes, I was raised in a Lutheran home, which was very Scandinavian, very ethnic. And I don't know if you realize that most Scandinavians are Lutheran the way, Italians are Catholic. So it was not a really profound personal commitment that I was raised with. And when I was in high school, I just started asking, how do we know Christianity is true? Just that. I'm attending a
Right.
public high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I just started asking, how do we know Christianity is true? And unfortunately, none of the adults in my life could answer that question. I talked to a Christian university professor and I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me. That's it. And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, but all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it was a psychological phase that I was going through. And so about halfway through high school, I decided, well, maybe Christianity just doesn't have any answers. And I very intentionally set it aside and started on a search for truth. I decided, I guess it was up to me to find truth. And I realized very quickly that if there was no God, there was really no meaning or purpose to life. There was no foundation for ethics, just true for me, true for you. There was not even a basis for knowledge. In other words, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space, how could I be confident that I could have access to some kind of universal, absolute objective truth? Ridiculous. That's how it struck me as a 16-year-old. Ridiculous. So before I even graduated from high school, I had absorbed all of these isms, from moral relativism, skepticism. And in my science classes, I became a determinist because we're just complex biochemical machines anyway. And so I was very much primed for some years later, I was in Europe. We had lived in Europe when I was a child, and I loved it, so I went back. And that's how I stumbled across the ministry of Francis Schaeffer called L'Abri, which is in Switzerland. And as you know, it's an apologetics ministry. That's the whole point. It's cultural apologetics. So he's looking at ideas as they percolate down through a culture, through art, literature, music, and even movies. And that's the first time I ever heard anyone make a case that Christianity could be defended by good reasons and arguments. And the first time I'd ever met Christians who could engage with the secular worldviews that I had absorbed. So I was incredibly impressed. And I didn't become a Christian right away. It took a year and a half because I wanted to be really sure, right? Christianity had already let me down once. So I wasn't going to go there unless I was really, really intellectually convinced it was true. But that is how I became a Christian. And it is why I now write about apologetics, because, my biggest goal is to help other young people who are asking the kind of questions I was asking. when I was a teenager. And so my books are on apologetics. I teach apologetics at Houston Christian University, and I love it. This is my dream job.
That's wonderful. We love Francis Schaeffer here at Classical Conversations, and we have our students, I think, watch How Should We Then Live? But in your book, Total Truth, which I want to touch on because we have that in our Challenge 1, which is basically our freshman year program. You talk about pre-evangelism. Tell us a little bit about what that means and how Christians can use this concept to share the gospel.
Yeah, I think this was one of the most important themes in Francis Schaeffer's work. He said the reason we have so much difficulty communicating with the secular world or even with our own children is that the concept of truth has changed. In every civilization, there's a sense that there's a natural order and a moral, spiritual order. But the assumption is that these are combined into a single cosmos, and that therefore truth will also be a single, coherent, integrated system. But with the rise of modern science, many people in the West began to say, no. The only reliable form of knowledge is what we know by science, empirically testable facts, what we can see, hear, weigh, and measure. And what do you do then with moral and spiritual truths? Well, it was said that they weren't really truths anymore. So Schaeffer used to illustrate with the diagram of two stories in a building, right, to show that truth itself had been split. In the lower story, we still had science and facts and reason and so on. And then moral and spiritual truths were tossed up into the upper story, where they weren't even considered truth anymore. They were considered your personal preference, your personal values. And he said, this is the main barrier to communicating Christian truth, because most people now do not think we're even talking about truth. They think when we talk about Christianity, we're in the upper story, which is the realm of relativistic, personal, private, what makes your life meaningful to you. And so, and the pre-evangelism, his point was that in many times we have to do a two-step process. Then we have to first explain to people what we mean by truth before we can help them see that Christianity is true. And I'll make it personal. That was exactly what I had to go through, because I arrived at L'Abri, like I said, embracing moral relativism, skepticism. I didn't think there was such a thing as truth. And I had to do that two-step process. I had to first be convinced that there was such a thing as objective truth before I could even consider whether Christianity was that truth. And so that's why Schaeffer talks about pre-evangelism. It's all the barriers you have to knock down before you can finally give the gospel.
Now, one of the things that I have done on this show is ask people to define truth for me. So what have you found to be the definition of truth that we are trying to get people to realize? What's that end goal?
Do you remember a few years ago, people talked about being reality-based? That's a pretty good definition. Reality-based. Because people put Christianity in the upper story, to use that two-story metaphor, they don't think Christianity is reality-based. They do think it's private, relative, subjective, what gets you through the night. And so it's very important that we
works
say no.
For me. It doesn't mean it works for you.
True for me, true for you. Exactly. And so it's important that we start with explaining, no, truth is what corresponds to reality. And when we talk about Christianity being true, we mean that's true in that sense, that it's true about the universe, about all of reality. And that is a big step in communicating with a lot of people today.
Now, you have this new book out, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. We see gender is not true anymore. Sex isn't true anymore. All of that has become relative in our culture. So what is this book about, and what led you to write it?
Yeah, I have, in a nutshell, I saw a problem and I saw a solution. And the problem is, of course, that masculinity is being so denigrated today. My eye was caught by an article in the Washington Post that was titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a respected mainstream publication, a Huffington Post editor tweeted, #kill all men. You can buy t-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." You can find books now with titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" So the incredible hostility that has become socially acceptable to express against men. I thought we need to get to the bottom of that. Where is this coming from? And even men, by the way, are jumping on the bandwagon. One male author wrote a book where he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So,
Mhm.
and you may have seen this because it was in the news just a few weeks ago. The director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So that was the problem I saw. I wanted to answer, where's this coming from? How did the secular definition of masculinity become so negative? And so in the book, I do explain that. But then I was also researching sociological data on Christian men. And I was astonished that Christian men test out as being the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers of any group in America. And I thought,
Mm.
wait, this is not public knowledge, even in the
Yeah,
church.
they don't share that data, do they?
Yes, I had to go digging in this academic sociological literature to find this. And that was the final reason I wrote the book. I said, this needs to get out, into the public. So what they have found is that evangelical Christian men are the most loving to their wives. And by the way, they do interview the wives separately, which is important. And so what they're really saying is that the wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's expression of love and appreciation. Evangelical men are the most engaged fathers, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce of any group in America. And then the real stunner was evangelical husbands have the lowest rate of domestic violence of any group in America. And I read this and I said, like I said, we need to get this material out.
Yeah.
Let me read you one quote because sometimes one quote can kind of punch it home. This is from a sociologist named Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia, considered one of the top marriage researchers in the country. Well, and he gets published places like the New York Times. So this is an article in the New York Times. And he says, this is a direct quote, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. So that was a turning point when I said, I have to write this book and get this information out there.
So the research shows this, but that's not what you see in the mainstream media. It says that us evangelical white males are the most hurtful of their wives, that we're the ones oppressing them and that we need to let our wives be free. But that's not what the wives are reporting.
Yes, I did introduce this in the book with several quotes. It was easy to find. I'll just give you two of them. It is no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. And that was in a Christian magazine, by the way. And then this was from the co-founder of the Church 2 movement. The theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so let me give you just one more Brad Wilcox quote just to counter that. He says, he turns to his fellow academicians, right, who are all secular at a place like University of Virginia. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So the bottom line is Christians do have a very practical answer to reconciling the sexes, as I say in the subtitle to my book. One that has stood up to rigorous empirical testing. So this isn't just, like a Christian pastor saying yay rah to his congregation. This is sober, serious, solid empirical research. And so we really should be bold about bringing it into the public square as an evidence-based solution to the problem of toxic behavior in men.
Yeah, we should follow the science, is what you're saying, which they love to parrot at us. But where did this idea of toxic masculinity, especially toxic, come into our vernacular, into the mainstream? Because it seems like 3 or 4 years ago, at least to me, that suddenly became a thing. Like, how did that happen?
Well, for balance, let me explain how it even came into the Christian world, because um, uh, the first pushback I always get is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of society? In fact,
Right.
my research found that is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. They went back to the data and they said they divided out committed Christian men who attend church regularly from nominal Christian men. And by the way, my students don't even know what nominal means, so I have to explain to them. It means in name only. NOM is Latin for name. So these are men who hang around the fringes of the Christian church and who claim an evangelical label, but who don't really live it out, and don't have a Christian understanding, a biblical understanding of terms like headship and submission. And instead, they infuse those words with meaning from the secular script for masculinity. And the numbers for these nominal men is shockingly different. Nominal Christian men, their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men. And the real shocker, they have the highest rates of domestic violence of any major group in America, higher than secular men. So you can see why the numbers are skewed. If you do a study and group them together, just say, oh, I'm doing a study on evangelicals, you're going to get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so, of course, the numbers are going to be skewed and misleading. And so that's what we have to help people understand. We need to give more encouragement to the men who are doing a good job. Support them and encourage them. But we also need to reach out to the men who are claiming to be evangelical, but who are actually living like secular men.
Yeah, I could see that, because if they're kind of almost Christian in name only, they're doing that is either part of a peer pressure or to maybe make their wives feel better. They're going to church, but they're not actively participating, that they could almost swing to the other direction. And I imagine that they say they divide that up. The men that are committed to their church, I mean, is that like once a month attendance or every Sunday, Wednesday? What's the definition of that?
At least three Sundays a month was how they defined it.
Okay.
In the largest study ever done, that's how they defined it.
Okay. Wonderful. Because I know Barna has its own definition, and I wasn't sure if it was similar to that one or not. Well, so some of these things I always say, the devil's very first deceit of humans is, did God really say? And he's always taken the truth and kind of twisting it. So, men definitely haven't always been perfect throughout history. But what was really the driving factor of the modern negative perception of masculinity?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. Because historically, most people would say, oh, maybe the 1960s was second wave feminism. No, it's much earlier. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. It turns out, well, before the Industrial Revolution, families worked together. Fathers worked side by side with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family shop, the family business. And I love this for a homeschooling audience, and educating their children at home, of course.
Right.
And many of us homeschoolers, I homeschooled my two kids as well. Many of us homeschoolers are also starting family businesses and so on, so we can recover that colonial style of, parents training their children in the adult skills. So we're trying to recover something that our culture has lost. It lost it when? At the Industrial Revolution. It took work out of the home. And of course, fathers had to follow their work out of the home. And for the first time, they were no longer working with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's where you see the language start to change. People began to protest. You can see this in the literature of the day. People began to protest that the men were becoming more egocentric, aggressive, self-centered, self-interested, ambitious, and get ahead, look out for number one. I'm greedy. I'm trying to remember some of the words that they actually used. So this is for the first time you start to see men described in a negative way. And it's because men were no longer fully integrated into the family the way they had been. And their character was changing. And so this is the important turning point. Um, in my book, Toxic Warring Masculinity, I do trace several more stages till we get to today. But this was the important turning point.
Hi, everyone. I can't believe it's been over a year since we launched 3 new Classical Conversations podcasts. And now we want to hear from you on how we are doing. In this episode's description, you'll find a link that will take you to a quick survey where you can let us know what you like about our podcast and what we can improve upon. Plus, if you have any recommendations for guests you'd like to hear on an upcoming episode, we would love to hear those too. Again, you can find that survey's link in today's episode's description. Thanks in advance for taking the time to help us best serve you through our podcasts. Yeah, that's great. I'd never heard of that, so I'm definitely interested in learning. I mean, it makes sense as you present it, but that as the men, especially because in the church today, you see that women are more involved, in many churches than their male counterparts, and that if the men went to work and left the house, that they were less concerned with the moral upbringing of their kids because they weren't having to deal with it 24/7 on the farm or in their home uh, as they tried to make a living. So, and of course, then we had the feminist revolution and women and the abortion pill, and uh, you're no longer needing to breastfeed feed children with formula. And then we've seen women going out to work, and now we see what we have in our culture today, which just very interesting to go down that rabbit trail.
So I do have a whole chapter on practical solutions. You can't raise this without talking about some solutions. And what I do is I talk about ideas that will be very familiar to you, which is how can we bring men home? How can we, flex the workplace a little bit? I give several examples of men who work 2 days a week from home, maybe, or men who are able to leave work early to coach their kids' soccer team, or sometimes men actually have started home-based businesses. And this pandemic had a very small silver lining, and that is that
Yeah.
a lot of men discovered they did like working from home. In one survey, 65% of fathers said they don't want to go back full time because they've gotten so much closer to their family. And just recently, the New York Times had an article with a great title. It said something like, during the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that.
Mm.
So right now is a really good time to say, what are some ways that we can, flex the workplace to allow men to be more involved with their children? I'll give you one concrete story because it's fun when you can see an actual example. But one of my students was married to an IT professional who came home during the pandemic, and because he was home, he was able to be much more involved with their homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He was taking his kids to soccer and sports, and because his wife was freed up from some of the family responsibilities, she started a part-time business. She is an opera singer. I had a student
Wow.
who's an opera singer. And so she started a voice studio, and the entire family is benefiting from the added income. And when I interviewed the husband, he said, I'm never going back to a cubicle. Our family is so much more balanced now. And then the final kicker was, he told me the time I used to spend commuting to work every morning, I now
Right.
spend praying with my wife.
Mm.
So I give lots of stories like that just to inspire people on how maybe they really can find a way to reintegrate the family. Even in a post-industrial age, are there ways we can reintegrate families? And most important, fathers, reintegrate them more into the family.
Now, I've heard you say this is the most controversial book you've ever written, and of course, you've written about plenty of controversial things. But why do you think that this is your most controversial so far?
It was a surprise to me. I really thought my earlier book, Love Thy Body, would be more controversial because it deals with issues
Yeah.
like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really the cutting edge issue today. But at least, maybe in Christian circles, at least, this one I got a lot more people being triggered. So I have, even at a Christian college, a lot of my young female students identify as feminists, and they would get
Right.
triggered if I said anything positive about men, as if I would thereby demeaning women. But men were defensive too. When I told them I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." And then when my students would tell their family and friends that they were working through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first question was, "Whose side is she on?" With that tone, "Whose side is she on?" As if you have to be either a male bashing feminist, or an angry reactionary. So as a result, at the beginning of the book, I put a sociological study that kind of helps get people over this. You don't have to just wholesale be pro or con. There was a study done by a sociologist he's very well known in his field, and so he gets invited to speak all around the world. And so he invented this little experiment where he asks young men 2 questions. First, he asks them, "What does it mean to be a good man?" If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy they say he was a good man, what does that mean? All around the world, young men had no problem answering that. I'll read you their responses: honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And they had all the way from Brazil to Sweden to Australia, same basic answers. And then he would say, "Well, where'd you learn that?" And they say, "Well, it's just in the air we breathe." And if they were in a Western country, they would say, "It's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage."
Right.
And then he would follow up with a second question. And he'd say, "What does it mean if I say, 'Man up, be a real man'?" And the young man would say, "Oh, no, that's completely different." And I'll read it again. They say, "That means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid." That's their words. And so clearly what's happening here is men are made in God's image, and they do innately know what it means to be a good man. It's the software that God has created us all with. It's Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. We know what's right and wrong.
Right.
But young men are also feeling a pressure to be the real man with traits that we usually today consider more toxic. And certainly when decoupled from a moral vision, they can easily slide into things like dominance and entitlement and control. And so it suggests a different strategy that we can follow. Instead of calling men toxic, most men don't respond well to being called
No.
toxic.
No, we
Nobody
don't.
would. But what it means is, can we tap into their innate awareness of what it means to be a good man? Can we encourage, support, and affirm them in what they do know about being good? And this gives us a much more positive strategy for dealing with these issues.
That's wonderful. Do you feel like because you are a woman that this is going to be more easily accessible or accepted into society versus like if a man was writing it from maybe a more defensive position?
Well, I'm not quite sure yet, because I told you the first question is, "Whose side is she on?" The second
Yes.
question was always, "And why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway?" So that was always the second question. um, so I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not quite sure. I'll have to tell you though, one response I'm already getting is from more egalitarian women who don't like the fact that I'm showing that theologically Protestant, theologically conservative men are doing very well. I would think everyone would be happy.
Yeah. So there's an answer out there for you. There's a direction that we can head. There's a light on a hill.
And they're following that light. I mean, the thing is, I don't engage in theological debates in my book. My goal was to show, what do Christian men actually live out. I looked at sociological data, psychological data, because that was my interest. I was interested in, okay, sure, the leaders and theologians might say this, but I want to see how it affects real ordinary people. And so the book is largely reporting on what ordinary Christians say. And I myself was surprised. I have to tell you, I did not know that Christian men theologically conservative Christian men would test out so well. You remember my earlier quotes. Theologically Protestant men test out the highest, the best of
Yes.
all major groups in America in terms of being loving husbands and fathers. So I would think this is good news and that we should be eager to celebrate it and to bring it out into the public and to counter the negative narratives that we hear so often.
Yeah, I was on Twitter the other day and I saw an article. I didn't read the details of it, but it basically said, people are dating the opposite. Democrats aren't dating Republicans, Republicans aren't dating Democrats. But it was a liberal lady, and she was complaining that all the men she was attracted to were conservatives. Which I know that you don't have to necessarily be evangelical male and be conservatives, but in general, those two typically align. So it was just kind of interesting that even those who profess a different worldview are seeing the attractiveness of what a committed Christian male would be in society.
I agree, and like I say, the sociological data really backs it up, and and even cross culturally, this was interesting. I spend most of the time in the book talking about America, just because you have to have some limits, or the book gets too big. But I
Sure.
do have a section internationally, um, th- quoting anthropologists and sociologists who look at the impact that evangelical Christianity has in other countries. For example, Latin America, machismo culture is very much geared toward, you're a real man if you're out there drinking, gambling, fighting, sleeping
Hmm.
around. Um, and this one anthropologist who made a study said she was shocked. She thought evangelical Christianity would be even worse, that it would make men into these overbearing patriarchs. And she says, that's not true. When a man becomes evangelical, he stops drinking and gambling and visiting prostitutes. He brings that money home. His family's standards of living goes up. And she says, if there's if there's a women's movement in the developing countries, we should call it evangelical Christianity. It has the qualifications for being a good women's movement because it reconnects men to their families. It counters what are sort of traditional male vices and makes men, committed husbands and fathers. And and I have about 3 studies, so they all find the same thing. One of them is titled "The Evangelical Gender Paradox," and this
Hmm.
was done by a sociologist at the University of London. So it was a very large study all through Africa and Asia. And she said it's a paradox because it's not what we think. We think evangelicalism is going to make men into overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs, but it doesn't. She says, let me see if I can find her quote. She says, she says the same thing. If there's anything that can qualify as a woman's movement, evangelical Christianity, qualifies because it does counter what she calls, again, the traditional male vices, adultery, alcoholism, things that have caused a lot of suffering for women. And she says that the irony, of course, is that we're talking here about as she calls it, a backward, unsophisticated form of Christianity. At least that's what secular Westerners would say. And yet, she claims that conservative evangelical Christianity has done more for poor women around the world than Western feminism has, or that any Western aid societies have.
Well, I mean, if you look at the long history of the world, I mean, I think that's very, very true that Christianity has definitely led to the uprising of the poor, the widowed, the females. That Christianity lifts everyone up because we see that inherent dignity that they have being made in the imago Dei of the Creator. So, one of the things that I also wanted to find out from you, you mentioned this earlier, was that 50% divorce rate, but really when you divide that up to the nominal Christians and the committed Christians, that like actual Christians, not Christians in name only, very minute divorce rate, but very high divorce rate for those nominal. What are things that committed Christian men can do to minimize and help reduce this seemingly significant abuse opportunity, divorce of maybe members of our church that we think are maybe good men?
I think the main thing is to actually understand the secular definition of masculinity, the script that the secular world produces, because these nominal men are obviously not taking their cue from the Bible. They're taking their
Yeah.
cues from the secular world. And so that's one reason I spend a fair bit of time in my book explaining the secular script and how it arose. Let me give you just one example, because this might be one of the most important stages as I go through the stages of how secularism kind of became more and more toxic. We'll give them that word. For the secular view, we'll give it the word toxic. But the rise of Darwinism had a huge impact on concepts of masculinity.
Right.
Darwinian thinkers said basically that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would have to be those men who were the most ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. So to recover your manhood meant getting in touch with the beast within, right? Your animal nature. That was your core. This, by the way, this is when the Tarzan books became very popular, right? Because
Okay.
he was
Raised by animals.
raised by apes, right? So he never lost that internal wildness, that that barbarian core. At the end of the book, he turns to Jane, and he's even though he's learned European customs by then, but he turns to Jane and says, "I'm still a wild beast at heart." And so, and there was a more serious literature too. You guys will know this because you all homeschoolers, but there's a genre called literary naturalism, which also tried to show in fiction a Darwinian worldview, the best known being Jack London. Most of my students have read The Call of the Wild.
Yeah.
He wrote about dogs, but they were metaphors for humans. He was trying to convey a naturalistic view that we're just products of evolution, the struggle for survival, genes and environment. There's no real free will. So what happened then is, in terms of how it affected masculinity, Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them. And now the Darwinian script was, you should live down to the animal nature within. The secular code for masculinity was defined as crude, combative, governed by the biological instincts for lust and power. And by the way, Darwin himself also argued explicitly that women were inferior to men. So part of the script too was to denigrate women as inferior. They were on a lower rung of the evolutionary ladder. Darwin admitted that women were more sensitive and intuitive, but then he said, those are traits of the lower species. So even the things that women were said to be good at showed their inferiority. So this was a huge impact on the secular script, redefining it as, essentially, the biological nature is your true nature, and you get in touch with that to recover yourself, your authentic self. And so this is where a lot of Christian men are picking up some of the messages as well. I should say the nominal Christians. The nominal Christian men are picking up these messages as well.
Now, how does this affect culture overall? Because right now, of course, the transgender movement is very cutting edge. We've also heard a lot over the last 5 years about racial and economic equality. But how does this war on masculinity affect the wider culture?
Whoa, if you have a low view of men, that's half the population. So I would say that primarily it has two impact. On the one hand, there's my student who said masculinity has been beaten out of us. So we do have men who feel as if a culture is so hostile to masculinity that it's harder for men to get ahead. There was a study where young men said feminism has so much impact that it's made it harder for men to get ahead. Or another study, this one is in the book, a study where 46% of men in America, so that's almost half, said they agreed with the statement, these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. A Wall Street Journal, there's a woman who's a psychotherapist and writes in the Wall Street Journal, and she said more and more young men are coming into my practice who feel demeaned and demoralized because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. So Let me quote you another interesting study. So this was a study showing that we do have both of these sides are both true, and that's
Mhm.
what makes it so difficult for men to kind of find their way. Is that on the one hand, the culture is so negative to masculinity, and on the other hand, it has this sort of macho Darwinian view that you discover your true self by being
Mhm.
aggressive and assertive and like the beast within. And as a result, boys are falling behind. This may answer your question more than anything else. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education, from kindergarten to college. Most colleges now are roughly 60-40, 60% women, 40%
Mhm.
men. More women than men graduate from graduate school and even professional school like law and medicine. More men than women commit suicide, are addicted to drugs and alcohol, are homeless, are uh, victims of violence and perpetrators of violence. 90% of people in the prisons are male. I used to work
Mhm.
for Prison Fellowship, so that was a statistic very, very well known to us. And even male unemployment has gone up. Um, the researchers are telling us that male unemployment is now at Depression era levels. It's not showing up in the normal statistics because these men have stopped even looking for work. So they
Right.
had to dig deeper. But male unemployment now is at Depression era levels. That's shocking. And their life expectancy is going down the last 3 or 4 years. Women's has stayed the same. So it's not a general trend. It's only male life expectancy that has gone down. A magazine called The New Scientist had an article where they said the major demographical factor in early death is being male.
Wow.
So I do think it's about time that we started to say, shouldn't we maybe have some compassion on men? Shouldn't we maybe start looking at what programs might help men and help boys in school? Because of the feminist movement, there have been lots and lots of programs. Millions of dollars have been spent on curriculum, that supports girls, books that support girls, um, after school programs that support girls. There are 4 times as many scholarships for girls than there are for boys. And that's great. It's wonderful that girls are moving ahead. They're taking
Sure.
advantage of this and they're moving ahead. And you have to remember, most universities did not even permit women to attend until the mid 20th century.
Mhm.
I'm glad I was born after that.
Sure. Me
so,
too.
so girls have done amazing with the opportunities given them. But it is now time to say, is there something we can do for boys as well? Are there some programs we can put in place to help these boys who are falling behind and who are feeling demoralized and who are failing to launch, right? That's the term now. Failing
Mm.
to launch is sadly true.
Well, Nancy, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I want to respect your time and our listeners' time. And of course, they can read all about this research, hear what the solutions are, and start living up to the imago Dei of masculinity instead of the Darwinian view of masculinity. And we can read all about it in The Toxic War on Masculinity. Nancy, where can we get that book? And what's the best way for us to connect with you if we want to learn more?
Yeah, so, well, obviously you can get it at Amazon, as you can get everything there. You can buy it at christianbook.com, wherever your favorite book site is, or maybe you even have a brick and mortar store, which would be great. And my website is nancypearcey.com, nancypearcey.com. My publisher has just gone in and given it some bells and whistles, so it looks really nice. But nancypearcey.com. And then you can survey all of my other books too, because they're there with some, you can see what else I've written as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we read 3 of her books in our curriculum, which are The Soul of Science, Total Truth, and Saving Leonardo. And we just appreciate the impact that you've had on our students and on the world. And thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I always love talking to homeschoolers. It was a favorite period of my life when I was homeschooling my kids. So good to talk with you.
I hope you enjoyed this special episode with Nancy Pearcey. She was wonderful to talk to. Please share it with a friend and go pick up the book at Amazon or your favorite book distributor, and make sure you grab a copy for a friend too.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.